Funding for this program has been provided by the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission.
In town, when you hear drought, they talk about, I can't water my yard as much and I'm cutting back on this and that. In a rural Nevada context, when you talk about drought, you're talking about, especially those folks in the range agriculture business, you're talking about threats to their income.
One of the outstanding features of the drought that we've been experiencing lately, and this has really been the case in the last 1 to 2 years, it has been so warm. We had the warmest winter on record in all of California and most of Nevada. The Sierra Nevada had its warmest winter by far on record in the last 120 years. But anytime you have higher temperatures and you have drought conditions, this means that water is lost faster. It evaporates faster. It doesn't come down, evaporates on the way down and so forth. Higher temperatures are like getting less precipitation.
So that's another part of the equation. It may be close to normal as far as rainfall in particular areas, but you have higher evapotranspiration rates because of the higher temperatures. Looking at some of these areas that are in D4 here, this would be out by Lovelock, where Rye Patch Reservoir. So below Rye Patch Reservoir, we've had 2 years in a row where there have been 0 water deliveries to the agricultural areas there. So we consider that there's major crop losses and major socioeconomic impacts that are occurring in those particular areas, as well as out in the Fallon area.
Even when we're not in a drought, Nevada is still the driest state in the nation. We receive less than 10 inches of rainfall every year. But there's more to the drought story than just limited water. Ranchers feel that environmental groups have unduly influenced the Bureau of Land Management. And this has changed the dynamic between the BLM and ranchers.
Good morning, good morning.
Eureka, Nevada has a long history as an agricultural and mining community. Most mornings, locals like Nevada Senator and longtime rancher Pete Gokachia, his son JJ, and fellow ranchers gather together to discuss the latest issues that are affecting ranchers across the West.
If you've got water today, you're pumping groundwater, and because all the surface water's gone. When you look at Fallon or Lovelock in those areas, they're completely out of water. So in this area, it really hasn't impacted it a whole lot because we are pumping groundwater. But what has been impacted has been the groundwater levels.
You got to keep moving your water to where the vegetation is. And naturally, these springs do that, but that's not the case this year. Those springs are dried up, so those cows will come to wherever that water is. And these ranchers have had to move the water to where the vegetation is.
Are you seeing any reductions in numbers on cattle or AUM?
Oh yeah, there's a huge number reduced since when I grew up here as a kid. All these places that ran 1,000 head of cows are now running 300 or 400.
While nature may or may not provide optimal conditions, the ranchers don't always agree with the BLM's decision over how many cattle or sheep they can turn out on their permitted allotment. In recent years, the BLM's Battle Mountain District of northeastern Nevada has been in conflict with the ranchers over its decision to close a major portion of the Argenta grazing allotment, public land essential for their operations.
We had about 6 acres of wetlands or creek bottoms that were the basis of the allotment closure. 6 acres closed 92,000 acres of federal land last year. And our recommendations or our proposal last summer was fence them. If these 6 areas are such an issue, let's fence them, let's exclude cattle from those areas, and let's graze the remaining part of the allotment. That proposal was shut down cold.
The BLM has no desire to put any industry out of business. Ranching has been going on in this area for generations. Ranching will continue to go on for generations. It's a legal use on public lands. We've been involved with a drought situation continuous since 2012. And we've been having to make management decisions based on the drought and the impacts to the resources since then.
My grandpa came from Switzerland in 1870. He started in Eureka, went to Elko, and then Battle Mountain, and back to Elko, and has been ranching ever since. And we've kept it up. One time when they were at Argenta, they ran 8,000 head clear to Austin. But that's a long time ago. Now, these ranches are all smaller. Well, I think all of our kids are in ranching, one way or the other. 4 girls and a boy, Dan. It's been in their blood all these years. It was in my blood, and they love to ranch.
They worked and helped since they were little kids.
They learned how to work when they were little kids. They used to cowboy all the time. When I was a kid, it was fun to ranch. Now you've got so many restrictions from the BLM. They hold you here, they tell you this, they tell you that, and they don't know which end the cow eats on.
The key areas, what they call a key area, is a place where they do their utilization study. They place those right on a cow trail, and so you don't have a chance of not exceeding your utilization levels that they give you.
We've got these what's known as key management areas, and they're positions on the ground that we continually use for a reference. And we look at the forage that's being utilized by the cattle and compare it to an area that is not being utilized. And when the vegetation is reduced by about 30% based on sound scientific methods, then that's been our trigger to remove cows.
One of the issues with this drought management that the BLM has imposed is often these very small areas, which people are calling postage stamp areas, very, very small, you know, maybe 1/3 of an acre is this total area, it's dictating grazing management on the rest of the entire allotment. So if they meet a use trigger here, which again, cattle have not even been in here this year, they have to move their cattle from the area, even though there's ample forage in the uplands. So what it means is these very small areas are controlling the grazing on hundreds of thousands of acres of grazing allotments. And it's putting ranchers in a situation to have to go out of business. There's a very distinct transition here. So you look at the restrictions being placed on the grazing in the entire allotment because of this riparian area, but literally 3 or 4 feet away, we have these grasses that are, 3 feet high or more. Some of these are up to my waist. A lot of buildup of fuels.
In 14, they called us in February, all the Argenta permittees, and said that there was going to be no cattle turned out until maybe fall. And fall's when we normally come home with cattle. Their reasoning was the drought. And our question to them was, how do you declare a forage drought in February? We don't get rains, it might not grow in here until June.
What happened last year is we got some good spring rains. Month of March, we had some really good rains into April, and we had grass that grows. With a little bit of rain, you can get a lot of growth in this country.
The ranchers felt the spring forage would allow their cattle to graze the allotment, but the BLM shut down 92,000 acres due to 6 acres of riparian area that they determined needed rest from use.
At the time, we told them the areas aren't that big. We'll fence them off at our expense to protect them. If it's going to be a huge issue, we can do this. And they said, oh no, by the time we do the EAs and the studies and all the hoops and paperwork, it could be 4 or 5 years before you have clearance to do this.
It's our understanding that the rancher wanted to fence off the area, but your office wouldn't authorize it.
In that situation, I think that had to do with fencing along a private public boundary. But we have worked extensively with these, with the Argenta permittees. In fact, right now we're underway on developing a number of exclosures around riparian areas.
During the conflict over the Argenta allotment, the BLM asked for assistance from a national riparian service team, which was created in 1996 by the BLM, Forest Service, and other government agencies, to be a catalyst to bring together all stakeholders and help manage the valuable wetlands on the range.
This riparian team, though, has come in and they've looked at several of these areas that we propose fencing, as well as several other areas that could or will be an area of contention. Their recommendations was fencing. We're looking at doing some riparian exclosures, some water development. That was one of their biggest issues, was the lack of infrastructure. And a lot of the development that needs to be done is on federal land.
Ranchers have a strong case for demanding water distribution methods and infrastructure, as they have the water rights on public land.
Grant Gerber, he was an attorney for us. He organized a grass tour. And what that grass tour was is we invited the general public. We had ranchers from Humboldt, Eureka, Elko, Lander County were all represented. And we had county commissioners from the 4 counties, as well as state representatives and senators. When we went out on this tour, we wanted to show them that there was actually grass in the allotment and it wasn't in the degraded condition that BLM was making it out to be.
If we're requesting and working with the rancher to reduce their AUMs, that means there's just not that feed available. AUM stands for Animal Unit Month, and it's the amount of feed that is needed for 1 month for a cow and a calf. Typically in Nevada, you're looking at about 20 to 30 acres of land that could support 1 AUM. Throughout the district, we have about 350,000 AUMs, and we've voluntarily reduced about 130,000 of those AUMs.
The BLM is saying voluntary. They say, you do this, this is what you do. You take the non-use, or we'll close the allotments. So what they're doing is extorting people, and they're robbing them of their livelihood.
What's the basis of the dispute to why there's a problem with it?
A lot of it stems from a different interpretation of monitoring data and the interpretation of the range conditions.
We visited an allotment that was closed in 2015 because of BLM's environmental assessments.
So in the drought EAs that the BLM has put out, they cite a lot of rangeland literature and research about drought and the impact on vegetation. And a lot of the literature they cite talks about how especially herbaceous species like grasses are especially impacted by drought, how those plants work hard to build up root reserves to make it through that drought. They create reduced seed heads. They don't put as much of their energy into producing seed. They're just trying to survive themselves rather than reproducing. What we find when we come into these areas and you find plants, some of these perennial plants, you talk about a reduced seed head if it were drought. You know, it's a sandberg bluegrass. That is not a reduced seed head. That is a very substantial seed head. Each one of those has a tremendous amount of seed that it's putting out. The timely rains and the moisture that's been received here, the vegetation just isn't exhibiting vegetative drought.
One of the tools that the BLM uses to determine grazing policies is the U.S. Drought Monitor.
The U.S. Drought Monitor is a weekly drought map, and it's produced a joint production by NOAA, the USDA, and the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. The process not only includes looking at a variety of indicators, which include hydrologic, climatological data, soils data, but we also look at impacts data as well from agriculture.
And one of the sort of instructions to the authors of the Drought Monitor, and this has been the procedure that's been followed since day one, if there's 3 situations and one of them is pretty good, one of them is medium, and the other is not so good, we portray the Drought Monitor according to the one that's the worst off. So it sort of picks on the one that is having the most impact.
This entire area, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, says it's in severe drought. which is multiple classes higher than pre-drought or even normal conditions. So, you know, there are tools available that the government puts out that separate the difference between hydrologic drought and vegetative drought.
One of the tools ranchers feel isn't used enough by the BLM is the vegetative index.
So that's a satellite-based product. The satellite looks down and it sees how green the vegetation is, and it adjusts for how green it normally is, because in Nevada it's not as green as Kentucky, obviously. So green here means a different thing than green there. So we try to get as objective of information as possible, and on fine scales, because as you know, in the summertime, these thunderstorms that we see here are not very big, and you know, the allotments are pretty large. One end of an allotment can get a lot, and another can get a little.
Since 2012, we've crafted a Drought EA, an environmental assessment. Drought EA focuses on methods like water hauling, and that allows greater disbursement of livestock to take them out of certain areas where they could be concentrating and overgrazing a resource in a particular area. We also look at reduction in numbers and changes of season of use.
3 or 4 years ago, when the drought environmental assessments were first being discussed, they were pitched to the industry and to local government in that these are going to be a win-win. And there were a lot of good things in there, in all honesty. There was increased ease of getting water hauls, less red tape for doing developments, temporary fencing, water developments in cases where they were needed. So it was kind of sold to the industry as a bag of goods about this is what we need. We're going to use adaptive management and flexibility.
There were provisions to allow livestock permittees to operate outside of their current season of use in their grazing permit. And what we found is that that flexibility that was promised is very seldom used.
When the decision came out in Argenta, it didn't have any of that in it. It went right to the most extreme, reduction in livestock grazing.
You know, I often say the easiest management is prohibition, because restriction and prohibition is easy. You can simply tell somebody they can't do it, and it's non-management. It's not true management. We have ranchers that have been asking for water hauls for multiple years, and they've never received authorization to do that. You know, 99% of the rangeland issues is water. If we could distribute livestock across this landscape, there wouldn't be a lot of the issues there are with livestock grazing management.
The goal of movement of the animals is to mimic nature's process from the past that maximize the potential of the land.
Native herbivores did that back during the Pleistocene, when we had a lot of herbivores in the Great Basin, and at least a lot of different species of large herbivores. And they would migrate seasonally up the mountain, following the green up the mountain, leaving the plants to regrow after they'd been grazed. And then of course we also had large predators chasing them around, so that got the movement too. So now to have the natural herbivory, ranchers have to play the role of moving the animals in a way that makes sense for the plants.
And if there's no feed, we're not going to turn our cows out. If there's no water, we're not going to turn our cows out.
Maybe that's what people need to understand, is that just because you're allocated a certain number of AUMs to turn a certain number of cattle out, if the range conditions don't warrant it, you're not going to do it.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. It's called managing your resources and taking care of what takes care of you and your cattle.
I want to add one thing that I think is intuitive, but it's very seldom pointed out, and that is people who make their living by grazing on public lands do not make a living by destroying the grazing properties on those public lands. So when anybody starts out in the issue with the culture of somehow these folks are going to try to do something while nobody's looking to graze for another month or something like that, it's like if they destroy their allotment, they've just destroyed their source of income. Think about that.
They give us 10 days to remove our cattle from the allotment. That is a process that in the fall of the year, when the cattle want to come off, takes us 45 days. The Argenta allotment is 330,000 acres. Ended up, BLM found 14 head of cattle in a remote canyon that they trespassed us. It was basically an attempt on BLM's part to have documentation that we had failed in our attempts to run cattle out there. In the 30 years that we've been here in Battle Mountain, we've never had a trespass.
Is that really working with the ranchers in that particular situation? Shouldn't they be given more time to do that?
Certainly 7 days is a fair amount of time to manage your livestock and remove them if needed. But
even in 150 square mile allotment?
Sure, the cattle are known positions. They're known, they know where they're grazing, we know where they're grazing. There's water sources that they'll concentrate around. So the livestock, an operator can certainly manage his livestock and round them up.
You can ride across this flat and miss a cow on what looks like flat ground. There's little draws and necks and valleys that you don't even know about.
We had to bring them all home, bring them off the mountain, and bring them all home and feed them and try to find pasture for them, which we found pasture for some of them. We hauled them all around the state. And then we had to feed the rest of them on dirt, on dry dirt in the summertime, and they didn't do real good. They're supposed to be out in the hills eating grass, and in the summertime you just can't feed cattle on the ground. Feed them hay it just gets dustier every day. They need to be born and bred here and learn the country. They have to know where the water's. You can't go buy new cattle every year and you would never make it. They would never make it in this country. 50 years ago, when they ran a lot more cattle, we had less fires, a lot more sage hen, a lot more deer. If you just go back in history a little bit, like I said, and see cattle numbers, get cattle numbers from 40, 50 years ago, and talk to the old timers about the sky turning black with sage hen and no fires. I mean, you didn't even hear of fires. And now, I mean, that's the BLM's huge budget for firefighting.
Since 1960, the 8 largest fire years by acres burned have occurred since 2000, and federal funding for fire suppression efforts have more than tripled since 1990.
So if a fire came through here and there was a wind to spread sparks and embers into a plant like that, that old dry grass would burn down into the roots, and that plant would be much more likely to die because of the accumulation of the old thatch from previous years than if it had been grazed periodically on a regular basis.
Many ranchers feel alone in their fight to continue their family legacy, which has gone on for generations. The efforts of the Argenta permittees have led to a new agreement that's been reached with the BLM.
We had a number of decisions that had to do with closing those use areas, and they were upheld in court. And now we've reached an agreement with the permittees to open it up again.
With the change then, John, does that mean you guys made a mistake?
No, there's been no mistakes made. We've got the monitoring that supports it, and we now have a grazing plan that's going to be under heavy scrutiny by us. We've got a national team, a national riparian service team that's involved.
You got to sometimes force the activity of actually having a conversation, because you can't get to know each other if you don't converse. So communication's a big component of that. Back even when I started with the Bureau, I think the employees had a better understanding of what it took to make a living on the ground, because we were a lot more tied just as a society to the agricultural resources and to the natural resources.
I think from our perspective right now, the situation out there is more transparent, more collaborative. They've come to an agreement, which took some work to do, wasn't easy. But I think the nervousness factor and the anxiety factor associated with those allotments for the time being is down a few notches from what it was when we were doing grass tours and all that other sort of stuff.
But then the question is, when the drought is over or the forage indicates it's plausible, will they ever get back to the AUM numbers they had originally? And I don't think many of them feel that that's ever going to happen with the current attitude about grazing Nevada's public lands.
Our grazing permit is part of the value of our ranch. When we buy a ranch, that is figured into the purchase price. We pay for that. That's what determines the value of our ranch. And we purchase it, we're taxed on it, it's a property right, as are our water rights.
If they take our numbers away and they reduce our ranch down, and I walk and I lose my ranch, no one's going to buy it for a ranch. So it's virtually, you know, the value of it. And they say that, well, you know, you still have your deeded ground. Well, when you buy a ranch, part of that price of that ranch is because you have the permit. Without the permit, it would not be as expensive as they are. And when you pay taxes on that permit, which, so that makes it to where, and they tell you it's not. It's just a privilege they give you to get a run out there. No, it's part of our ranch and we own the water. That's the deal. It's in the deed.
Management has moved away on the land to courtrooms and boardrooms. And it's almost like if you are an individual that makes his living on the land and are closest to the land, you are discredited because your opinion is swayed. And we've got to get away from that. We're losing as an industry, and I don't like to lose, but I'm fearful for that next generation. You know, I made a promise that I was going to fight every day for that next generation, and it's getting tough. I'm running out of gas.
I will. To my dying breath, I'll try to keep these ranches intact.
Funding for this program has been provided by the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission.